Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for making it this far. So hopefully the biscuits have given you a bit of a lift. See that? Yeah, great. So I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues, Caroline Murphy, Tish Gibbons, and Sarah MacCurtain. And the title is fairly self-explanatory in terms of looking at anti-unionism in Ireland. So we're kind of presenting results of two kind of projects which are kind of put together, or two stages of the project put together. In terms of the background, I suppose, why are we looking at this? Well, first of all, the idea of union representation has become, it's always been topical for people who teach industrial relations, but also has become topical nationally. I mean, I was struck during the fuel protests the number of times that national commentators were talking about and politicians talking about how there's institutions available for dealing with disputes and social partnership. It always became kind of a popular term again, even though it's ignored. And of course, social partner are trade unions. And with the introduction of the EU adequate minimum wages, the purpose of that has been to try to uplift minimum wages or the standard of living across the EU, and the EU explicitly recognise the links between union representation and the low share of low-wage workers, and has sought to try to strengthen collective bargaining in the EU. And notably, a part of the EU directive, which hasn't got a whole lot of academic or public policy attention, is the EU's explicit links between explaining why collective bargaining structures have eroded, and they explained that by the decline in union membership, and they explained that by both the presence of non-standard or precarious work and by union busting practices. And the inclusion of union busting practices was not part of the proposal, the EU's proposal on the directive. It wasn't part of the EU's consultation with the social partners, but it was something that was included in the final version because of lobbying by the European Trade Union Confederation. And they have tried to place this as an issue at the EU level. We know that in Ireland that union recognition and collective bargaining is very problematic in terms of the institutional supports. Ireland has the 10th lowest level of collective bargaining coverage in the EU, and we know that the legal supports for union recognition are very poor. And 20 years ago, Darrell Dart and Tom Turner did a study about anti-unionism and how to deal with it. And as seen there, you can see that 2/3 of their survey union officials found that union recognition had become more difficult to secure. So what we're looking at, well, what has changed in that time, and also to add a bit of nuance to the discussion about anti-unionism. So our aim is, through two parts, through a survey and through interviews, is to look at the views and experiences of union officials in Ireland in their roles of organising, representing. So what do they face in terms of employer approaches to them? So in 2024, we sent a survey through the Irish Congress of Trade Unions to individual trade unions and then down to union officials to gather their experiences of the factors that inhibit them in their work in representing workers. So what are essentially the union busting practices that they experience. And that was funded by the Frederick Stiftung Foundation. I'm sure Anna will be here, and I'm sure she'd say I pronounced that incorrectly, so apologies to Anna. So funded by them. And the second part then is we did a follow-up where we interviewed 2 union officials from 11 trade unions who were all experienced union officials, and we wanted to ask them more about their personal experiences of how employers approach them. And that's where we get a lot more, I suppose, of the nuance of looking at their experiences. So in terms of the survey, the blue and the purple are the most important colours there. And effectively, almost 2/3 of union officials say that union recognition has become more difficult to secure during their employment tenure. So basically, we're talking about practically no difference from Dart and Turner's survey 20 years ago. And I suppose that's not surprising, given that the legal environment hasn't necessarily become much more supportive. We've had kind of the Industrial Relations Acts were introduced, which was, sold as something which would help unions who were having difficulty with union recognition. But we know from union officials, and we know know from the high-level group on collective bargaining that it didn't do what it was sold to do. So there hasn't been a significant change there in institutional supports. If you look then at the most prolific union busting tactics or union avoidance tactics that union officials experience, and we've used categories that have been used by Roy and Gregor Gall, where they categorize tactics into awkward, sweet, fear, and evil. There's other ones as well, but these are the ones that were most prominent in our survey. And the most prominent one of all that union officials come across is the stonewalling by employers. So just no contact, not engaging, refusing to engage. And significant proportions of union officials experience that. On top of that, then, the next most prolific one that they found is preventing union official access to the workplace. So you'd expect that if stonewalling is going to be a very prevalent union tactics, well, then you'd expect that they wouldn't get access to workplaces. And after that, the next most important one then is down there with the evil stuff category, which is that line managers are briefing workers against the union. So the evil stuff category is very much about the idea that employers engage in propaganda against unions, that they are kind of the troublemaker who are interfering. And all the other ones that were prolific with Dart and Turner are fairly similar here in terms of union officials' experiences. The sweet stuff, the trying to garner employee loyalty, the kind of union substitution effect of trying to keep employees happy rather than going with trade unions. So improving pay and conditions, resolving employee grievances, they're also prolific as well. The management consultants wasn't one that union officials experienced regularly, but they had a lot of union officials had experience of occasionally. So the management consultants isn't as seemingly prolific here as it has been in other countries, in particularly America. When we ask union officials for their qualitative comments on their experiences with employers, the most dominant theme through all their comments is about the fear that workers have of engaging with unions. So they listed, a lot of the comments are lists of the ways in which employers instill fear in workers, the fear of reprisals, isolating workers, moving them to places where they'll have less contact with other workers if they seem like somebody who's basically trying to organize or is an activist in the union. And also the kind of more contemporary ways in which employers instill fear, particularly in regard to things like remote working and hybrid working. So things that might not be contractual entitlements, which workers have garnered over time, and that being used as a lever of control by employers. So threatening to take the remote working entitlement away from workers. And also the second thing that comes up apart from fear is, union officials comment as well on the apathy of workers. And of course, it's a bit tricky, I suppose, to distinguish, well, where does fear end and apathy begin? But they describe it as worker apathy, like, there's not much we can do here, so they don't try. And when you talk to union officials, it's such a tricky balancing act, because they have to try, in their work, they see it as organizing, that they have to try and get workers organized. They have to try and get them to have some kind of sense of self-efficacy in trying to take action against employers. And then union officials have to make an assessment as to whether that sense of self-efficacy, as to whether that strength is strong enough to push employers further. And if it's not strong enough, and if the employer hostility is too strong, then they have to pull the workers back, because they say they feel that this kind of burden of a decision as to whether workers should keep going in an organizing campaign. But if workers' will and strength isn't there, and if the employer's strength is too great, then the union officials feel that they have to make a decision and say, look, we can't really go much further than this. I wish we could, but we can't, because I think the cost to you will be greater if we keep going. So it's a very tricky balancing act that union officials have to play. I suppose I want to concentrate a little bit on the next part, which is from the interviews with union officials, because generally speaking, when you read about union recognition literature, it's always a yes-no dichotomy between, employers recognize unions or they don't. And that's it. It's a very kind of black and white kind of picture. And the interviews with union officials show it's not a black and white picture. And I suppose 20 years ago, Tony Dunnan had talked about how you can have different ideological viewpoints within the same firm. And that's kind of what this kind of typology that we've developed tries to point to. So we've developed these different categories of organizations according to their approaches to unions as seen by union officials. And on which side are we looking at? On this side, you can see that you have the archetypical kind of union, anti-union position by a company. So these are the organizations which are your stereotypical stonewallers. These are the silent assassins, as mentioned in the title. So the silent assassins is the term used by one of the interviewees to describe the stonewalling. You know, there's no hostility because there's no contact. You know, so there's just no contact at all. And any contact there is very hostile. You know, the union officials will often be greeted with maybe the guards being called if there's an organizing campaign at the gates of the company, or you'll get a hostile phone call from a HR consultant who's been hired by a company. But other than that, there's generally no contact at all. And then on the opposite side, you have kind of the stereotypical union recognized firm, the cooperative union recognition. And they are the kind of generally unproblematic companies. You have union recognition, you have collective bargaining, you have generally professional, decent relationships between the union officials and the managers. You have informal and formal contacts with them. And there isn't a big problem with employees who are shop stewards and employee representatives getting time off for union duties. But in between, then you have a lot more nuance, and it's not as simple to say that they're just recognized or not recognized. So the one I suppose that we look at is the double-breasters, and this is not new to us. I mean, other authors have recognized this category before, and this is typically refers to the multinational companies who have multiple plants in the country, and some of those plants, they recognize unions, and in some of those plants that they don't. So these kind of seemingly contradictory union positions within the one country. And then the other two that we've categorized, we've called double standard and hostile unionized. And I suppose when you're looking at this typology, we're really looking at two different things. One is the company's official stance towards unions, but the second thing is also the everyday managerial practice. So if you look at the double standard type of companies, these are companies with also seemingly contradictory positions towards unions. So you can have one where, for example, the corporate position of the union, of the company, I should say, diverges from individual managers. So you could have a company which officially does not recognize unions, but on everyday practice, individual managers can ring union officials looking for their help with problems. And this may be because they previously had professional relationships in previous employments with union officials, or it could be because a company used to recognize a union and then de-recognize them. But you still had that personal relationship between union officials and managers. The other type of double standard company is the company which talks to unions in some places but not others. And I don't mean plants, but more collective bargaining levels. So they may negotiate in collective bargaining forums at a national or international level unions, but they won't negotiate with unions at a plant level. So you have official stances which differ depending on the level of collective bargaining, or alternatively, you can have an organisation which recognises some groups of workers for union recognition within a company and then doesn't for other groups of workers. And typically the types of companies we'll be talking about are organisations, I shouldn't say companies because we're also including public sector organisations in this, where if you had a very strongly unionised group of workers within an organisation, they would recognise the union for those group of workers. But you had another group of workers who were poorly organised or precarious and they wouldn't recognise them. The last type of company then we'll talk about is the hostile unionised. And this is very much where the official stance diverges from individual managers as well. So the official stance is that the organisation recognises unions. But the everyday managerial practice is to marginalise unions as much as possible. So they'll negotiate with them about pay and conditions, but on everyday level, they don't want them around. So they don't tell them when there's employee problems. They don't tell the union when they have grievance and disciplinary issues. They have tried to have very little contact with the union. And one union official who's a very long tenure in the role described the role as she described it as slick HR. The fact that over time she felt that the union had been one time seen as an asset which helped companies with their people problems. And then over time, as HR become more sophisticated, that HR would take over the everyday issues that they used to deal with unions on and not contact them at all and marginalise them as much as possible. And individual union officials had very different perspectives on the extent to which, depending on the types of companies and workers, the extent to which they were valued by management. So for some management, unions were seen as an asset, helping them with problems, and in others, they were just tolerated. And they were tolerated because there was a collective bargaining agreement. And there was nothing they could do about it. And in some cases, you had individual managers coming into a company, kind of going a little bit rogue, threatening derecognition, which was against the corporate position. So you do have these contradictory positions, even when you have unions being recognised. And of course, what this means then is that, I'll come back to that in a second, is that even when you have unions recognised, it means that unions are spending quite a bit of resources trying to maintain their position within recognised companies. You know, we talk a lot in union recognition literature about unions trying to chase companies who don't recognise unions, but they have to spend quite a lot of resources in employments where they are recognised, just trying to maintain that presence and that prevalence and try not to be marginalised. So, for example, one union official talked about how, you know, there was a unionised company, but he said he could never get past reception. They didn't want him to meet any managers. So he had to spend extra time making sure that they knew that he was there to stay. So the last things then is, well, what do the union officials themselves want in terms of policy choices or policy changes? And this was from the survey in 2024, and perhaps not unexpectedly, they primarily want stronger union recognition, stronger legislation which will support union recognition, and also penalties on employers for union busting, and victimisation of workers is a big thing, and that victimisation of workers comes in a lot in the qualitative comments in the survey. And I suppose in terms of hopefulness, because this was just before the EU directive came in, union officials were very hopeful and had very positive expectations about the impact of the EU directive and how it would support union recognition and collective bargaining. But they did also recognise in the qualitative comments that, you know, they had been burnt before, is the way they've described it, in terms of previous industrial relations legislation. So they understood that the effectiveness of the directive would very much depend on its transposition. So overall, we can see, well, there's been little positive change in terms of union officials' experience since Dart and Turner survey 20 years ago. But also, as I show about the nuance in perspectives, is that the black and white union, non-union is not necessarily particularly helpful in trying to capture all the approaches that employers have towards unions. And the last thing is, you know, the lack of institutional support for unions, you know, really goes against the increasing concern about the consequences of the lack of unionisation, not just economically in a way in which the minimum wage directive presents it, but also for the democratic consequences and the rise of populism, that there is this growing concern about, you know, the lack of voice within workplaces and the consequences for the lack of voice outside of workplaces.